2 weeks ago, I showed you how to find new names using descendancy research. Last week, I showed you how to add names to Family Search. And this week, we will look at how to submit names for temple work. There are several different ways to do this, but as before, I will restrict myself to showing you Family Search and Ancestry. Let's start with submitting a name directly in Family Search. And we'll use the same family as we have been looking at for the last 2 weeks. And we'll start with William Herbert Midwinter. I believe I already know his ID. And there he is. And as soon as I bring him up, I will look at his details to make sure there's nothing that looks as if it needs to be altered at all. Certainly there, everything looks in order. And at the top of the page, we can see 3 tabs. We're on Details. We've also got Memories, but we want to click on Ordinances. And as you can see here, we can submit all of his ordinances. So we're going to click on Request Ordinances, and then on the blue Request button again. And notice that the church policy on submitting temple names comes up. And let me stress that what it says at the top there, that temple ordinances are sacred and should be treated with respect. There are several sections, as you can see, but they basically break down into 2 categories: who you can submit for and who you cannot. Let's look at each of those. First, do submit ordinances for direct line ancestors, their families, and the descendants of your ancestors. You can also submit names of possible relatives, such as those with the same last name who lived in the same village with a known ancestor, but for whom you cannot prove the relationship. Second, do not submit work for famous people, Jewish Holocaust victims, or persons born within the last 110 years. The exception in each case is if you are the closest living relative or you have permission from the closest living relative to do so. Although you do not need to read the policy every time, you still need to know what it is, because you have to check the box that says you have read and will comply with the Church Temple Ordinance policy. And once you've checked the box, you can then click another button that says Add to Temple Ordinance List. You'll notice that instead of green, these are now in yellow. And over here, we can click on the legend, and we can now see these are submitted but not printed. Now let's click on Temple over here at the top, and we can look at the not printed list. And we can see William Herbert there. we have to put a check mark in his name, and of course there we have to have a card. So let's choose to print a family ordinance card. And you'll notice down here that for those who cannot print, a 16-digit family ordinance request number will appear in the generated PDF file. So even if you don't have a printer, you can still write that number down and take it to the temple. In this case, I only want to submit the name for baptism and confirmation, so I'll make sure those are the only ones checked before I click Continue. We then get instructions. It needs to be on white paper and so on. And then we see the actual form. And as you can see right at the bottom, we've got that 16-digit number that was referred to earlier. You can print up to 3 cards per page. In this case, I've only chosen one, but you can print 3. And they'll just fit one under the other. And in this case, it's just for baptism and confirmation. So we would then go ahead and hit print, and then we'd have to cut out the cards to take to the temple. Now let's look at the procedure if you use Ancestry. Obviously you have to sign in if you're not set to do so automatically. Okay, now I have to navigate to the person I want. In this case, it's going to be Phyllis Agnes Midwinter. And we need to click here on the family search icon. I'm now signed in to Family Search, and you can see that there's a green arrow. That means that we can submit names. We could, we then click Request Ordinances, and we then have a choice of whether to simply continue with the ordinance request or compare and update. Now you'll notice that I have done a little bit more research, and there is additional information about her birth and death, which we didn't have before. So we're going to compare and update. You'll notice where information is identical, there are no check boxes, but where there are differences, there are check boxes. So here, for example, I will put a check mark here in order to move the information from Family Search over to Ancestry. And I'll do the same with the place of birth because that's slightly different. And that's more correct to say Bangor, Carnarvonshire, Wales. I don't have a date for her in Ancestry, so I'll add that. And this works both ways. There are sources here, such as the 1911 Census of Wales, and we want to transfer that over as well. And then I'll click Save Changes. So I've got all those changes made, so now we can simply request ordinances and just continue with the ordinance request. And what this does is to open up Family Search to exactly the same page that we were on before, right on her ordinances page. And we can then submit those exactly as I showed you. Now, what can we do about somebody who is very close to being born 110 years ago? Remember, we said we couldn't submit names for people born less than 110 years ago. So here we have a program called Eternal Reminder, because we don't want to let the name get lost and we don't want to forget to submit it either. Fortunately, somebody had a bright idea that covers this eventuality, and as I mentioned, it's called eternalreminder.org. If a person would turn 110 within the next 5 years, this site will monitor the PID of the person and then send you an email. It is restricted to within 5 years, because if it were much longer, there is a distinct possibility that the changes could be made to the record through mergers and so on. The first thing we're going to do is to click Get Started Now. And as with so many other things that interact with Family Search, we do have to sign in again. Once we have signed in, you can see here we just put in the ancestor's ID, and you'll remember that I did have an ancestor, or at least one of these, that was very close to 110 years. So once you've put the information in, we click to verify. And this is the one that we had before that was an issue. And then we're going to click Add Reminder. You'll notice it says November 1907. And obviously that's less than 110 years ago. So we'll click Add Reminder. And I've now added him. That is all there is to it.